Hey, I'm Mehul here with DevExpress, and I'm here with Scott Hunter. Now, Scott, for those rare few individuals who are not familiar with you, can you introduce yourself and what you do at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I work at Microsoft on what's called the Azure development team. And the Azure development team, we kind of build all the developer experiences around Azure. So that's all the .NET server-side frameworks. So that's ASP.NET, Entity Framework, WCF, all come from our team. We build all the tooling in Visual Studio around web. So that's the HTML, CSS, JavaScript editors, the ASP.NET project system and the publishing stuff. We build all the Azure SDKs. So if you're actually talking to Azure from .NET or PHP or Node or Ruby, we build the SDKs for that. We do NuGet, the package manager for .NET, and we also build the cache that's in Azure. So we're kind of a grab bag of stuff, but it's all developer stuff.
Oh wow, that's a lot of things. All right, so today's presentation that you did with Scott Hanselman, you guys showed a lot of interesting things. Can you just quickly give me a recap of, because there's a lot that you've already put into Visual Studio, and you shared a little bit about that, right? Now, what are some of the things that you're really proud of that you've released so far for Visual Studio?
From a Visual Studio perspective, there's two things I think we're proud of. Number one is standards compliance. Having a very standards compliant HTML and CSS editor. They're also, in the last two releases, we've made each of them extensible, so we can actually plug things in to actually enhance them. That's how things like Web Essentials, the plugin that Mads on my team builds, works, is by plugging in and taking over some of those things. Browser link is another part of Visual Studio that I'm really proud of. That's basically, for people that don't know, when you launch an app from Visual Studio, we take Signalr, which is our real-time framework. We run a Signalr server inside of Visual Studio, and we inject a small piece of JavaScript inside of the app running in the browser. That allows us to have a two-way connection between the browser and Visual Studio. So Visual Studio can send commands to the browser, and the browser can send commands back to Visual Studio. When we first shipped VS 2013, the only thing we actually supported there was if you're actually in the editor in Visual Studio, you could press a keystroke, and we would send the update to all the browsers that were connected to Visual Studio. So we call that live refresh. Now with Browser Link, with Web Essentials, we're showing some of the potential that we have there, where you can actually go into your browser of choice. It can be IE, Chrome, Firefox. You can go in the developer tools, start changing like the CSS in the browser, and push a button, and we'll synchronize the change back to Visual Studio. So as you change things in the browser, that change gets pushed back to VS. We also have a mode where you can, what we call inspect mode, and you can press inspect mode and move your cursor all around the screen, and we'll show the markup inside of Visual Studio that actually is responsible for wherever your mouse is hovering over. And likewise, you can go back to Visual Studio, make some changes, and push them back. So you can, the way we like to say it is, you can work in whatever environment feels most comfortable to you. Sometimes you want to change colors and some styling in the browser. Sometimes you want to change the markup in VS, and we're going to support both of those moving forward.
Yeah, the browser link stuff was awesome, and every time I see a demo of it was very cool. You showed something today, where essentially, it's like you showed today, where you're in the browser tools, you want to make a change without going back to Visual Studio, and we'll put a link up to your talk today. Now,
and by the way, that's the tip of the iceberg. Oh. We think we can do a lot more with that. So one of the things that, let's say you're in the HTML editor in Visual Studio. But typically you're working on some partial piece of the page. You're not working on the entire page. So we can't actually validate your document in Visual Studio because we don't know. What if you're actually just working on a partial that's inside of a layout page?
Right.
We don't have the entire document in that editor window. Right. Now, I can actually push that over to Browser Link into the browser. The browser's got the entire document. So what we can do in the future is we can basically say, hey, we'll push the document to the browser, let the browser look at the entire DOM, figure out what errors you might have, push those back into Visual Studio, and our hope is not only can we push them back in, but you can click an error and say, do you want us to fix it for you? And we would automatically fix it. So imagine you launch your page in the browser, Visual Studio shows a couple of errors, you click the error, say fix it, and the browser just refreshes. And
very cool.
So that's some of the stuff we think we can do in the future. Other crazier ideas, people have always asked us about the designer in Visual Studio. We haven't really modified it a lot in the last couple of years because it's actually based on Internet Explorer 6. It's a hacked up version of Internet Explorer 6. We looked at it, and we think it's 2 to 3 man years for us to go move to like IE11 inside of there. And I really wouldn't want to do that, because if I do it, well, the browser's continually changing, and I'd have to try to stay in sync with that. So a much better approach is, what if we move the designer out of Visual Studio into the browser?
Oh, interesting.
And that way, maybe there's even a toolbar in your browser window, and you can actually drag controls or markup to the page, and all we're doing on that side is injecting them into the buffer editor in Visual Studio, and so then your browser is your designer, and you're always current on the latest browsers because it's the browser. And so that's an area we want to explore as well.
That's a dream come true. I mean, that's literally what, a lot of people are targeting a specific browser for, so that would be awesome.
So that's, so I'm super excited about those areas and where we can take them in the future.
Now, about the Visual Studio Extension thing, I thought that was very cool that you've opened it up now, so almost anybody can essentially make an extension and get into sort of even that file new experience, right?
Correct. We don't have file new yet, but we will have. You can do it today. It's really hacky.
Right.
The next version of Visual Studio will have it. Some of the file new experience is going to change probably in the next version of Visual Studio. Oh. And so we didn't finish our extensibility because we were afraid that if we did, we'd have to throw it away and there'd be a new model in the next version. So we kind of stopped there, but we do have a couple of extensibility points.
Okay.
So one of the things that we talked about but didn't show today was we have this notion of what we call scaffolding. Mm-hmm. And so you can right-click in a project and say, I want to add an MVC controller, you can add a Web API controller, you can add web form, we don't call them controllers, but you can actually scaffold web forms. Right. That is actually, as of VS Update 2, fully extensible. In fact, the talk today, we talked about the web forms scaffolding that we're building. That scaffolding is actually on GitHub today.
Oh, nice.
And so if you want an example of, we can go find the link and put it in the video.
Put that in there.
You can go and grab that code and see how we did it. And by the time Update 2 ships, the goal is that when the scaffold dialog comes up, there'll be a Add Extensions button there. And if you do it, we'll actually go out to the gallery, show stuff. If you click one, we'll auto-install it for you.
Very cool.
We want to do that for templates in the future as well, but we're just not there yet.
Now let's talk about OneASPnet. Now, I love that you are doing this to simplify some of the approaches.
Yep.
One of the key things I'm kind of wondering about, though, in OneASP.net, I mean, I get the concept that it is OneASP.net, but you've got checkboxes for web forms, MVC, right next to each other. So you could literally create a project with web forms and MVC together. What's the thinking there?
Well, the thinking there is we have a lot of customers that have maybe long-term investments in web forms.
Right.
I've got an app that has 100 web form pages, and maybe I want to start dabbling in MVC just because I'm curious. So today, or before VS 2013, if you wanted to do that, it would not work. You could actually install the NuGet packages for MVC in, but none of the tooling worked. And so it was a broken experience. That was the problem, and the reason we created OneASPnet was we gave you a bunch of choices in the file new dialog. If you chose one of them, only what you chose would work in the project. So if you chose Web API, you didn't get some of the MVC tooling. If you chose, basically it was an either-or kind of scenario. And so the main premise of OneASPnet was saying, let's get away from these project GUIDs. A project GUID is something in the project file, and we were keying on that before. It's like, oh, if it's got this GUID, this tooling's enabled. If it's got this GUID, this tooling's enabled. And so what OneASPnet really is about is we no longer honor the GUID. We don't care about the GUID anymore. What we actually do is we go look and see what NuGet packages are in your app.
Oh,
and the tooling lines up accordingly based on what NuGet packages we see.
Okay, very nice.
So if we see that there's MVC, you get MVC tooling. If we see that there's Web API, you get Web API tooling. If there's something missing, like let's say you right-click, we also offer you some of the MVC tooling anyways, and we'll just go and add all the right stuff to your project. So if you create a web form project, now you can right-click and say Add a controller, and we'll put all the right folders in, we'll put all the right NuGets in to actually have those two things run side by side. But the idea mainly is, we know a lot of customers have older sites, and they might want to try newer technologies. Maybe want to put some Signalr in, put some Web API in, put some MVC in, or you create an MVC project and you want to add some Web API. I mean, these are not either-or choices. These are things that can be used in combinations.
I see. So you want customers to say, listen, get on 4.5 plus, etc., and try these new things. Yes. They're exciting. They're useful. All right.
Try any of the new stuff. Don't feel like you have to choose a template and then you're locked into whatever technology that template gave you. That was the real premise behind the OneASPnet thing.
That's very cool, and we'll have to link to your talk about it. Now, what about Signalr? Where do you see Signalr going? Right now, you're using it for browser link, which is a very cool approach, right? Is there scenarios in line of business apps that customers are coming to you for that says, hey, this is something we want to integrate?
So we do get lots of interest from in Signalr. I think one of the things we want to do with Signalr moving forward is we actually want to enable it for line of business apps. So we have an example. If you go to the Signalr repository, or it might be Damien Edwards' repository on GitHub. I think it's Damien's. We have a real cool sample of what if you take Signalr and the Entity Framework DB context and merge them together. And the idea there is you build an app and maybe showing data on the screen, and then I run the app on my browser, data shows on the screen, I add a record. When I add the record, we then send the change notification to the other version of the browser running, telling it, hey, the data's changed. It does a refresh, and so basically the screens are updating in real time as I move back and forth. So we're going to look at those kinds of concepts and try to apply them to the frameworks. Now the goal for us is to do that in a very seamless way. So if you want to go have a real-time DB context, we would just give that to you as a framework feature. So any way that we can find ways to fuse it into the product. There's a open source project called Meteor that does that as a JavaScript framework.
Right.
That does a bunch of real-time stuff. Anything anything we see interesting there is they're way too magical. We want to do more. One of the things we learned, historically is anytime we give you a black box that does a bunch of magic, that's not good. So we don't want to do that approach. We'd rather do an approach that's some really open thing that you can look at. As we move into a world where we start using libraries like AngularJS and stuff on the client side, how do I integrate AngularJS and Signalr? That's another area of interest to us. So.
All right, I won't keep you too much longer, but just a couple of short questions about AngularJS. Yep. It's all the rage, right? I get a lot of questions here saying, hey, and it's because these desktop big apps, maybe like Gmail or something, and people want to create that using the web. Where do you see that fitting in with ASP.NET?
So Angular is interesting. There's quite a few of these frameworks for the web. There's Ember, there's Angular, there's Knockout, there's Backbone. Right now, Angular is the rage. If you go to Google Trends and look it up, it crushes everybody else about midway through 2013. It just took off like a rocket. I think it's popular because it almost feels like web forms that runs in the client. It's got every feature you can think of. It's got routing, it's got model binding, it's got data validation, it's got forms, it's got all the bits and pieces of stuff it's got controls using directives. So it's actually a pretty full-featured framework for building a client-side application. And if you're, I think typical customers that use our frameworks, it's got all the things you might want to use to build a client-side stuff. There are people out there that want to write more optimized apps, and so they might pick like 17 smaller frameworks and wire them together, but we think a lot of customers don't want that much complexity in their apps and are willing to have a bigger framework. Now what's interesting for us is as we see a shift going into building more client-side applications, we want to see how can we take the best of what our server-side frameworks do and the client-side frameworks and kind of merge those things together into a single existence. So one of the scenarios we're working on right now is, I'll give you a great example. If you try to write Angular, or even if you write MVC, one of the things that happens is we have these awesome HTML and CSS editors. But the way you typically write an MVC application is you say @html.textbox, and you pass some parameters. Right. Well, you're not in the HTML editor then, you're actually writing C#. So you lose all your HTML IntelliSense, you lose all your CSS IntelliSense. So we're throwing around ideas of what if I can give you the data binding without having to have an HTML.textbox. What if I can actually make the markup actually stay the markup? So maybe it's @input, and with @input, we know how to have a data binding expression in the thing, but you can still write HTML, which means if you want to use your Bootstrap IntelliSense, that works. If you want your Angular class IntelliSense, that works. So that's one area that we're working on. The other area that we're thinking about is if you're going to build one of these apps, you've heard maybe the common practices are you want to render one time on the server and then render everything else on the client. So how do I make that experience kick butt as well? How do I make MVC have some markup that actually generates the server side the first time, but is actually also rendering a bunch of Angular helpers and stuff to wire the Angular side up?
It's those double brackets, man.
So we're trying to figure that out, and I think we'll have something later this year to show in the space. So,
I'm very much looking forward to it. One last question, Owen.
Yes.
I saw something very interesting today, and the biggest thing that caught me about Owen was the performance, right? And how much lighter it is in terms of assemblies that it uses.
Right.
So does this mean that ASP.NET is going to get more performant?
It is going to get more performant. One of the things about performance that I always like to ask people is, people go to these benchmark sites and they ask me, "Oh, Scott, your framework doesn't do 150,000 requests a second." Well, I don't know about you, but the people building apps on DevExpress, are they doing 150,000 requests a second on their forms?
Probably not.
So the benchmark stuff.
Some of them.
Some might. Skype.
Sure.
They're going to do a hell of a lot of transactions, but I think a lot of our customers don't hit those performance things. But I think it's still important for the framework to offer that performance if you want it. And that's
Absolutely.
That's one of the things that internally, when we started working on some of this stuff, the Skype team, and I'm going to call them out, they were one that we were showing this technology. They're like, "Wow, that's really cool." So what I can do is I can have my app, I can have part of my app just be bare metal.
Yeah.
So I can take the parts of my app that have to have really high request rates and make them bare metal. But hey, there's other parts of my app that don't get beat at 100,000 requests a second. And in those cases, it's easier for our development team to actually use a library like Web API or MVC to build that. And so the cool thing about the Owen stuff is we allow you to basically use what you want where you want. So today, ASP.NET basically tries to give you everything in one big kitchen sink or one big refrigerator, and it's all in there, it's all on all the time. In the Owen world, our hope is, if you want bare metal, we're going to give you bare metal. If you want bare metal for this part of your UI space, you have bare metal for that. If you want to have a big framework for another part of it, you can have that. And so you can dial yourself which way you want to go. This is kind of a philosophy change in web development that I think was brought forward by Node.js. If you look, the Java frameworks and our frameworks all kind of gave you everything. And then Node.js kind of came in saying, "Hey, we're gonna, for starters, here's a socket."
Right.
Now you can't write an HTML app with a socket.
Right.
You need more like that. So if you're in the Node world, you're probably going to use a library like Express.
Yep.
On top of that, but the cool thing about Node is you could use sockets for part of your app and Express for part of your app. So we're going to give you the same exact flexibility.
Oh, that's very cool. Now, I want to say thank you very much. We'll put up his blog and his Twitter. And once again, I want to say thank you also for keeping this excellent framework going. ASP.NET has evolved so much, and like you said earlier, Web Forms was created to help bring a certain set of developers forward to the web, and it's evolved to all these other great platforms. So
look what you guys are doing. I mean, the mobile stuff you guys have built the last year or so is amazing. That you can take all the stuff you guys have built and apply that towards mobile devices. It's awesome to see what you guys do as well. So
hey, we're just trying to build on to the innovations as well. So one thing Scott's talking about is some of the mobile touch-enabled stuff that we've done for ASP.NET. So thanks again, Scott. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.